So when I say that I love romance novels, I know exactly what people start picturing. Bodice rippers, Fabio on the cover, damsels in distress who are thrilled to be rescued by a man and can't do anything for themselves and don't know how to consent to anything. The Fabio thing is fair. It turns out he was on the cover of 466 romance novels. I looked this up while I was writing this sermon, so I will give you that. And the other things are fair too, because those exist in books. They exist in romance novels. But like any genre, like any kind of art, any type of book, there are other kinds of romance novels too. Like maybe a book about a Black woman who owns a vineyard in Napa, whose brother hires her one-night stand to come work for them. You know that plot, right? Or the book about a dating app developer falls in love with the nephew of the owner of the competitor app that she's buying. You're familiar, right? There's the book where a woman discovers that her hot new neighbor is actually a robot. This is not a spoiler. The book is called The AI Who Loved Me, okay? Or maybe books about queer love in Regency England between a criminal and a gentleman, or a sea captain and a vicar, or a lady and her best friend's maid. You know, those kinds of books. Or what about books written by a woman of color who left her job as a practicing lawyer and now writes powerful female characters with a lot of agency? And if that sounds too specific, I can think immediately of two authors who fit that. One of whom writes contemporary novels and one of whom writes intensely researched historical fiction, who puts people of color back into the stories they've been written out of. These are romance novels too. These and so many more, with such a wide range of plots and characters and themes and settings. Basically, anything you can imagine exists in a romance novel. There are contemporary romances and historical ones. There are fantasy and sci-fi romances, paranormal romances. I could list so many more kinds of romances, but you probably are starting to get the idea if you are not already familiar with the genre. And some of the books that I love most, some of the romance novels that really are near to my heart, are what's called own voices books. That's when the identities and experiences of the characters mirror those of the authors. And I love reading own voices books. I love it when the characters and authors have things in common with me and I can see myself represented. And I love reading them where they aren't like me. When I read books with characters who have experiences and identities that I don't, I feel like I learn something. And when those books are own voices books, I can trust that what I'm learning is actually true to someone's experience, someone's identity. And own voices books exist in other genres too. It's not just unique to romance novels. But in romance novels, own voices books mean that I get to read about a wide, diverse range of people finding love in the ways that they want to. Books about characters like me remind me that I am worthy of love. And books about characters who aren't like me remind me that other people are worthy of love too. Are there bad romance novels? Yes, there are absolutely bad romance novels. Just like there are bad books of every kind. There are poorly written ones and ones with bad plots and some with boring characters. There are books that are hard to get through. There are books that you have to stop reading because they don't make any sense at all. And there are books with lack of consent or dubious consent or interactions between characters that just don't model what I want to be reading. And there are also amazing ones. Well-written, great plots, incredible characters, and really good modeling of consent. So there are two things that make something a romance novel. Does anyone know what they are? One, romance, great, awesome. But do you know what the second one is? Not Fabio, but great guess. It's fiction, true. The thing that makes something a romance novel, a requirement of a romance novel, is that it have a happily ever after. It is required. That is what makes something a romance novel. So Martha told us happily ever after is only the beginning, right? It takes practice. A happily ever after doesn't mean things don't go wrong, or people don't have hard times, or communicate poorly and you start yelling at the characters, telling them just to talk to each other. It doesn't mean things don't need to be worked out. But it does mean that when you pick up a romance novel, you know that at the end, you're going to feel comforted or happy or satisfied or something in that vein. You should be able to believe when you finish a romance novel that the main characters are going to be okay, no matter what happens. Now, for some reason, in the last few years, I have needed books that make me feel comforted. Books where I know everything would be okay, even when there was conflict. Books where I got to read the happily ever after. From about April 2020 to September 2021, I did not read a book that was not a romance novel. Like literally no books that were not romance novels. I would check them out of the library and put them on my Kindle, and then I'd get the email 3 weeks later that my loan had expired, and back to the library they would go, because when I sat down to read, I never opened them. I only opened romance novels. I read new ones and I reread some. One time, very memorable time, I read a romance novel. I got to the end and I said, I wish that I could have not read that book so I could read it again. And so I closed it and then I opened it and I read it again from the beginning all the way through, like within 5 minutes of finishing it. It happens sometimes. I needed that happily ever after. And even though romance novels end with that happily ever after, I think you do often get to see that practice that Martha was talking about along the way. As people learn about each other and how to communicate and what's important to the other person. The best is when you get to the happily ever after, but you get there because they figured things out, worked things out, talked to each other, figured out what they need to do. Things are happy not because they are perfect, but because they're real. I particularly love when authors write loose series of books where the books don't necessarily come one after the other. You can read them in any order, but the characters are friends or family or somehow in community. One of the first romance novel authors that I read was Jasmine Guillory. She's one of the former lawyers I mentioned who now writes romance novels. And her books grapple with race and gender and consent and all these things without being about that per se. They're just part of it. So her core series starts with the wedding date. Alexa and Drew get stuck in an elevator together, and then he asks her to be his +1 to the wedding he's in town to attend. It's a pretty typical romance novel style plot. And then the next book follows Carlos, who's Drew's best friend, and a woman that he meets when she turns down a proposal by Jumbotron from her boyfriend of 5 months. Again, pretty par for the course here. And then in the next book, we have two best friends, Theo and Maddie, of Alexa from the first book. And they don't like each other, but they're in the bridal party together. And then the next book is Maddie's mom going on vacation with her and meeting someone. And I'm not going to tell you the plot of every single book, but you see how they slide together. You get these glimpses as you read each book into the relationships that you followed in a different book. Sometimes they're sequential, sometimes the timelines weave together or overlap, but you get to see beyond the happily ever after at the end of the book. You get to see other pieces of people's lives through the eyes of their community. And it's really special to get to see beyond that last page of the book What is happening in these people's lives? What continues when they're not the center of the story, but they're just living their lives and figuring out their happily ever after? I was most recently reading a book called If the Shoe Fits. It's a Cinderella retelling where the characters are all contestants on a Bachelor-like TV show. And the main character, Cindy, is talking to one of the producers, and Cindy says that the producer, Bex, doesn't seem like the kind of person who would like working on this kind of show. And Bex, who is a self-described gruff workaholic lesbian, she talks about how people who might not interact with a diverse community in their lives will tune in to watch the show. And that's how they sometimes get exposed to new people and new ideas. Beck says, people don't want to stand around and talk about how bleak the news was last night or argue about who they're voting for, but they will sit around in the break room talking about what happened on Before Midnight the other night. Last season's interracial couple was a big topic of discussion on shows like Good Morning America and The View. And Cindy muses on this, and then she thinks to herself, besides, queer people deserve to have their bad romantic decisions documented for the whole country to consume too. And it's tongue in cheek, but it also gets to the heart of things, right? Why I love to read diverse romance novels. If pretty, thin, white people get to have convoluted storylines that end in happily ever after, then why not everyone else? Why not brown people and fat people and disabled people, neurodivergent people, trans people, queer people, people who aren't conventionally attractive? Romance novels continuously remind me that I and everyone else gets to have love and find love and be loved in the ways that they want and deserve. And another thing that I love about romance novels is that they're not just about romantic love, right? There are other characters in these books too, friends and family and coworkers and all sorts of community. There are best friends who tell the main characters they deserve better than being mistreated by a partner, siblings who remind them that they are amazing just how they are and that they don't need to change. Wider communities celebrate and protect them. It's so important to see these wider communities. A Gentleman Never Keeps Score is a gay Regency romance about a Black retired boxer who runs a pub and a white gentleman in disgrace after some of his experiences are exposed. And at the end, Sam, the pub owner, reflects on how he feels about this man that he loves, which is the same way he wants people to feel when they come into the pub: warm, safe, and hopeful. He says, when people came together in pairs and families and communities, it was a kind of commonplace magic that warded off the dark and cold of the outside world. He hadn't ever thought he'd be on the receiving end of that sort of miracle, had thought it was reserved for people with fewer burdens and cleaner consciences. Community helps us face the hard things, and we all deserve it, not just those of us who have only done good things. If that is not a sermon about beloved community, I don't know what is. And I haven't even started talking about consent yet. There are still romance novels being written with bad models of consent where people don't have agency. When I start to read those books, I can't get through them. But I love the books where consent is a huge part, where characters explicitly talk to each other, where the raunchier activities are paused for conversation, for checking in, for making sure everyone is okay. I love that modeling of communication, of explicit consent, the ways in which consent can be incorporated into fun and sexy experiences. I love seeing someone being unsure if their partner is enthusiastically consenting and stopping everything just to check in. For some people, reading romance novels like this is the first time that they've had consent and healthy relationships modeled for them. And then they've been able to take that and incorporate it into their own lives and relationships. It's kind of like a parallel thing to OWL, I would say. A way for people to sneak in there, just get a little bit of information, a little bit of what things could look like. That's a whole other sermon that I could give. But all of this is to say, I love romance novels. They have a bad reputation, partly because of books that have existed, and partly because they are seen as women's fiction. And you know that we like to discount things that women like. That's another whole sermon that I will not get into right now. But what is not to love about books that teach people about healthy relationships and consent and remind them that they are worthy and deserve love? So I've started reading other books now. It does happen on occasion, but honestly, I'm still mostly reading romance novels because when I need a break from the world, when I need to sit down and not pay attention to everything that is happening around me, I love knowing that at the end of that book, when I close it, things are going to be okay. So if you need book recommendations, let me know. I have a lot to share with you, and I am always ready to discuss romance novels and really any book. I'm happy to talk about the things in them that don't go the way that we want them to, and the times when entire chunks of a book could be avoided by one conversation with each other. All of these things are real and true. I think it's important to me that we recognize that just like with everything else, types of books and art and things that are not usually what we go for can have powerful roles in helping to teach people about who they are and can be and how the world can be. So if you're interested in reading a romance novel, or even if you're not, I invite you to reflect with me on what might be possible through romance novels, what people can learn, and what they model for people who might not see it anywhere else. I invite you to take your picture of a romance novel that might have Fabio on the cover and just scoot it aside a little bit to bring in another cover that maybe has brown people on it, or queer people, or fat people, that has women in this day and age saying no to things, asking for what they want. And knowing that both of these things can exist in this genre, and that we can find the stories and the books that speak to the things we want to see in the world, in any genre, in any form of art. May it be so. Amen. Beloveds, this is the time in our service when we celebrate the bounty in our lives by sharing it with others. Today's offering will be shared with Malden Overcoming Addiction, a local organization whose mission is to connect the community with addiction support and recovery services, remove the stigma of addiction, and fight to eliminate overdose fatalities in Malden and surrounding communities. They offer a wide range of resources for those in active addiction and recovery and their family members, and welcome anyone who wants to join them in this work. If you are here in the sanctuary, the ushers will bring by baskets. If you are online, there will be a link to donate in the chat. And if this is your first time in worship with us, we invite you to let the basket pass you by. Your presence here with us is your gift.